and the questions of memory and identity to give the first presentation of this panel. Thank you.
I would like to talk on the Topos of suffering in Polish literature, but I have to stress one thing here, that when I say Polish, I don't mean ethnic Polish. Polish means those who identify with Poland, but their ethnicity is of no importance. And also, if we use the term Polish in the case in the way we use it now, Mickiewicz wouldn't understand. Okay, suffering is basically, well, universal aspect of human condition. And until relatively recently, suffering was seen through its connection to God. And every religion tries to answer the question why people suffer. But this is individual suffering, and this is something that I'm not going to look at. I'm looking at collective suffering, but I want to suggest certain way of looking at the collective suffering. Sorry, this is not the slide. Collective suffering. What I want to do with it is basically look at suffering as not just collective suffering, but rather as a cultural trauma, which basically means, and I'm using here Jeffrey C. Alexander, who says that cultural trauma occurs when members of a collectivity feel that they have been subjugated to horrendous events that leave indelible marks upon their group consciousness, marking their memories forever and changing their future identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways. What is important in this is it's not the event per se that is a trauma. It is how it's being transmitted, constructed, and understood. So, for instance, death or a plane crash can be simply death or a plane crash in which 50 people die. But it also can, if it's discussed, transmitted, and presented as a trauma, it can become a trauma. And I'm looking at only one channel of transmission, which is literature. There could be others, for instance, cinema, popular narrative, through museums as places of memory. So I am looking at the loss of independence as the major cultural trauma. And this is also a little bit tricky how to define this loss of independence, because obviously 1795 to 1918, and then during World War II, 1939 to 1945. What we have a problem with, we can talk about maybe 45 to 53 as a part of the trauma, Poland, early communist state. Whether this is a trauma or not, this is something that will not come into this lecture, but I am looking mostly at 1795 to 1939, 1795 to 1918 to see how it was constructed. And I have to say a few things about how actually it came to existence. And of course, as everything, it starts in Poland with Romantics, with Mickiewicz. There's no other way. But the question that I want to answer is, was the literature of the interwar period able to change the concept of identity based on suffering? And Poles are not the only people who like suffering. There are other societies and cultures where suffering is important. For instance, Esther Ben-Bassa wrote a fascinating book on the identity in the state of Israel entitled Suffering as Identity. There are scholars arguing that, for instance, Russians enjoy suffering. Without suffering, you cannot really be a Russian. And so we are not exclusively, we, the Poles, in whatever this means, Poles, we are not exclusively one nation that is for whom suffering makes a lot of sense. So I want to see whether the pacifist literature written between 1918 to 1939, that this literature was able to change the patterns of suffering. And what happened to those two best pacifist novels of the era by Rembek and by Wittlin. So we'll be talking about this slightly later. It is Polish romantic messianism that elevated suffering to its position as a cornerstone of Polish identity, because the tragedy of the nation was explained in terms of a struggle between the forces of good and the powers of darkness. Since Poland was made, I quote, this is Mickiewicz's quote, made fit for martyrdom by special favors. Messianism, a type of a religious consciousness closely bound up with millenarism, explained the role of Poland by creating an intellectual parallel between the sacrifice and suffering of Jesus and the collective sacrifice and suffering of Poland. Since the crucifixion of Christ resulted in an individual salvation, the collective suffering of Poland was seen as a precondition for collective social and political salvation on earth. Suffering within the religious outlook was thus seen not only as a necessary, but also as a constructive part of the mission to liberate the world, to free the people, and to give freedom to the people, not just to the Poles. Those are the texts. So texts from 1828, but most important is the 1832, the Books of Polish Nations, which explained the role of suffering. And I'm just on this page I just showed the main works which talk about the suffering. And what unites them is a concept what I call messianic suffering, the rationalization of that suffering. First of all, it was purposeful. It makes sense because its purpose was clearly defined to bring freedom to the people through the suffering of Poland. And this is important because this suffering, Romantics believed that they believe that that God participates in history, and therefore the suffering made sense. So it was first of all purposeful. The second, it was a sacrificial element. So it was a sacrificial offering for the greater good of the collective. So it was not for individual, but it was for the collective, and the collective, the Poland. And in that struggle between collective and individual, the weight was awarded to the collective, which is Poland. So individual did not enjoy the same rights. And the third element of a messianic suffering, it had to be altruistic. So let's look at the case, for instance, of suicide. Somebody in Polish literature, and this is rather fascinating, there's only really one suicide in Romantic literature, it's Konrad. Actually, it's Gustav who tries to commit suicide because he's in love, and then he gets transformed into Konrad. So he does not really commit suicide because he's unhappy, he transforms into a lover of a nation called Konrad. So Polish literature does not, like for instance, German or English literature, does not have romantic suicide. If you are unhappy, you can always die for Poland, yeah? But there's a problem. There's a problem. Suicide is not accepted by the Catholic Church. The Romantics assumed it will be accepted and God will reward those who die for him. Let's look at the case of Ordon. This is a case of so-called military suicide. He commits suicide, he prefers to, when Reduta is about to fall, he prefers to blow up the ammunition instead of giving it to the Russians. So he commits suicide. In reality, he didn't die. It doesn't matter. The point is that in the poem, he does, which means he committed suicide. No matter how we slice it, it is suicide. And yet, according to Mickiewicz, God will talk to Ordon because he committed suicide for Poland. So the Romantics were able to sort of deal with the suicide in such a way that if it's done for the greater good, for the people, then it was accepted by God, not by church. Here was a different thing, but God accepted the suffering. So those three elements have to be present to talk about rationality of suffering. And this fusion of purposefulness of suffering with older ideas of Poland's chosenness by God, which actually started at the beginning of 17th century, those ideas connected with the works of early Romantics such as Kazimierz Brodziński or Ludwik Królikowski led to the popularity of the topos of suffering Poland as a logical explanation of Poland's fate in the 19th century. Thus Królikowski in 1833 compared Poland's suffering to that of a pregnant woman whose birth pains were necessary because, I quote, they would bring new life to the world. Mickiewicz's major works focus on the purpose of Poland's suffering from his 1828 Konrad Wallenrod through his named A Gospel of Polish Martyrdom for the Nation, through his books of the Polish Nation 1832, to his Sorbonne lectures, when he equated the future independent Poland with that of a resurrection of Christ. In the 1840s, under the influence of a mystic, Andrzej, Mickiewicz argued that Poles were chosen to participate in God's work as they were, I quote, the brothers and the martyrs of freedom prepared for martyrdom. Other romantics, such as Krasiński, for instance, strongly believed that Poland's martyrdom furthered the progress towards general salvation and freedom. Karol Liebelt, a philosopher, I quote, said, fields of battles are now national altars where burnt and bloody sacrifices take place for the endless freedom and spirit. Well, after the second failed uprising, 1863, as Maria Janion, Poland's leading scholar of Romanticism, points out, the national ritual of martyrdom and death began. The everyday terror started earlier during the 1861 mass demonstration in Warsaw. This was also a period of Polish-Jewish unity. For instance, Michał Landy, who was Jewish, was wounded on April 8th, he died a day later, when at the demonstration he held a cross that he took from the hands of a dying Catholic priest. Those deaths were commemorated with postcards emphasizing the wounds of the dead as, I quote, photography became part of national theater of suffering because, I quote, national mythology is not only located in texts or oral tradition, but also embedded in visual images. And here the suffering was on display, accessible to all. To what degree the collective suffering of Poland and the actual suffering of individuals was united could be glimpsed from a book entitled Martyrology, that is the suffering of the Unites people in Podlasie region, about the destruction of the Unite communities from 1864 to 1882. The Unites were not Catholic, but since the Union of Brest in 1596, they accepted the authority of the Pope in Rome, so their persecution by Russia was severe. The 2 volumes of Martyrology pedantically enumerate the beatings and the tortures of the peasants, bull-whipping, horse-whipping, breaking teeth, pulling out hair, shaving hair, sentences to Siberia, taking away children, the suicide of the peasants, the list of the dead, and those forced to baptize their children in the Russian Orthodox Church. Their fate points out not just the magnitude of the suffering, but it also highlights, and this is rather important, because it highlights the connection between religion and collective suffering in Poland, attesting to the degree when the suffering entered, I quote, the core of the collective sense of its own identity. It was not just the poets who expressed their belief in a soteriological value of suffering. In 1848, young Stanisław Maroński, which employs the messianic understanding of Poland's suffering, as it is purposeful, the flower of freedom will grow, sacrificial, all people will run towards death, and altruistic, to spread justice and freedom to the world. Even women were participating in the suffering and were treated as active insurgents if convicted. For instance, Governor General of the Vilnius region, Murawiow, declared collective punishment for families of women wearing black, as it was seen as a form of commemoration for those who died during the 1863 uprising. Well, positivists were not fond of suffering. And they turn against the suffering and against the obligation to suffer, because at this time there's not just suffering, there's also obligation to suffer. You probably remember Wokulski and Lalka by Prus. Rzecki says to Wokulski, well, you want to fall in love with Isabella, what about helping Poland? And Wokulski gets very angry and says, I know what I did for Poland, what did Poland do for me? Anyway, some realist writers like Orzeszkowa, in her novel Nad Niemnem in 1888, search for consolation in the heroism and suffering of the fallen with a strong postulate to learn from the past mistakes to change the society. The most direct attack, as I just mentioned, was Prus's Lalka from 1890, as you know, the protagonist, Stanisław Wokulski, he was earlier sentenced to Siberia for participation in the uprising. He's sort of positioned in the middle of the struggle between the collective and the individual. And as I said, Rzecki, the old romantic, sort of wants him to sacrifice, because that's, as a Pole, he should be doing. Now, then we have Sienkiewicz, who is no doubt is probably most responsible for promoting suffering and popularizing suffering in Polish literature. His novels were to lift the nation spirit, and they did, but they also succeeded in presenting military traumas and the multiple faults of the Poles as their moral victories. Yes, the Poles in his novels did suffer, and so did Poland, but death, including military suicide, such as Wołodyjowski, was applauded as an ethical victory. Although Mickiewicz's historiography was condemned as too conservative and nationalist, his novels nonetheless became an extremely popular reading in Poland due to their intellectual simplicity and presenting past suffering as morally beneficial, Poles as superior, thus preserving the stability of the collective in terms of meaning, not action. If the messianic suffering was perceived by the Romantics as purposeful because it was based on their belief in God's active participation in history, for the positivists, the belief was simply impossible, as their outlook was heavily influenced by the enormity of the suffering they experienced and witnessed during and after 1863, but also by their scientific approach to the world. Positivists oppose metaphysics and messianism, thus the very concept of messianic suffering with its demand for collective sacrifice appeared nonsensical to them. They accepted that at that time there was no hope for Poland's independence, so they shifted their focus towards organic work and the work of the foundation, with their faith in altruism and help, but not sacrifice for homeland. Literature was to be utilitarian, should educate, improve the fate of peasants, women, and Jews, and promote not the suffering nation, but rather the society. And this is very important change of words. It's not the nation, it's a society. Yet the belief in the purposefulness of suffering was strong. For instance, this is a novel from more or less the same time, 1872. It is an anonymous novel, and the last sentence says, because that's what we need to do. The idea of love without an end, to reject temporal happiness, to sacrifice without boundaries for the homeland, for Poland. Now, these patterns, at the turn of the century, obviously those patterns started to change. And then there's the question, what happens in 1918? Poland becomes an independent country, so obviously, sorry. So obviously the patterns of suffering has to be discussed by literature, and of course it was. In the immediate years after 1918, writers and poets expressed pure delight at the release of literature from representing national traumas. Probably the best known expression of this joy is Antoni Słonimski's poem, The Black Spring, in which he chooses artistic freedom over, I quote, writing the Polish way. He prefers another way of writing, I quote, French or Chinese or Indian way, because, I quote, my homeland is free, I throw away from my shoulders the coat of Konrad. Ja? Ojczyzna moja wolna, wolna, więc zrzucam z ramion płaszcz Konrada, referring to the iconic character in Mickiewicz's drama. Similarly, Jan Lechon in his poem Herostrates demands to be free from patriotic representations. I quote, during the spring, let me see the spring, not Poland, a wiosną niech wiosny nie Polskę zobaczę. Both Słonimski and Lechon belong to a poetic group, Scamander, whose manifestos proclaim focusing on the present and not on the troubled past. Poetry was to bring joy and pleasure to the reader. They felt themselves to be free of they felt themselves to be a generation free from romantic obligations, and they expressed that. Wierzyński, for instance, used to recite his poems in a cafe called Under the Picador, and I quote, "conquered the public with poems that were pure shouts of joy, not pain." Another poetic group, Kraków Avantgarde, proclaimed its love for the future, all that's new and progressive, while rejecting the romantic notion of poetry as a prophetic act, and they saw poetry as an intellectual endeavor requiring discipline. Also, writers represented resurrected Poland, and that started rather quickly in the late 20s. This resurrected Poland was presented as corrupted, cynical, and this is in novels of Naukowska. There are quite a few novels which talk about the Poland of the 20s, which is not exactly what was hoped for. So we have, for instance, the group Przedmieście, which talks about poverty, the problems of workers, problems of Jews. Pola Gojowiczyńska's novels belong to the north. There's Naukowska's The Boundaries, Żeromski's Before the Spring. So in the late 20s, there's a whole literature which sort of shows disappointment with this resurrected Poland. So the question would be, what happens with those two novels which talks about the senselessness of suffering? And I have chosen two novels. It's not that there were many more, but those were really very well-known novels, two pacifist novels. What is important, they both appeared very late. So Witlin's was 35, just 4 years before the war, and Rembek's In Action, the Polish title is W Polu, appeared in 1937, so basically a year and a half before the war. Witlin's novel was extraordinarily popular. It was translated, I don't think those are all languages. It was translated in the 30s, but I think it was translated into 13 languages: Czech, Dutch, German, French, Swedish, Hungarian, Hebrew, Spanish. Thomas Mann thought it was one of the greatest novels he has read, and it was nominated for Nobel Prize. Rembek's In Action was also awarded quite a few lesser prizes, but still very popular. And the fate of the novel is pretty tragic, because Rembek himself came from a small town and took part during the war, but then during the Soviet-Polish War, 1919 to 1921. So as you can imagine, the novel ceased to exist after 1945. It wasn't reprinted, it was reprinted on emigration. Yeah, so it was reprinted in London, but it did not exist in Poland. Rembek was a persona non grata, and he was in such a difficult situation that in '56 he need help to simply have money to survive. But his novel did not exist, completely did not exist. What are those two novels? Okay, so we will start with Rembek. First of all, it's a story of one battalion, and it is not a successful battalion. They have problems, they lose, and it's also this part of the Polish-Soviet war when Polish army is losing. Rembek was himself a soldier. He was in the Kaniowska division of field artillery, and he took part in Battle of Dźwina, Warszawa, and Zamość. Now, the soldiers are simple, and it is more or less a collective protagonist. It's not one individual soldier. But there is a lot of tension between the soldiers and the officers, to the point that some of the soldiers escape to the Soviet side. Yeah? Soldiers complain, they are constantly angry with the officers, that the officers are interested in their stuff. There's no discussion about Poland, there's no discussion of, their suffering seems absurd. They die and they are wounded, but there's no purpose to it. So they constantly complain because they say, oh, we are here because our officers wanted to have a drink, so they forced us to be here. The critical response was extremely positive. So Dąbrowska, Sikorski, Kołaczkowski, basically most of the critics saw it as a masterpiece. However, there was also a very strong critical response, because Rembek did not uphold the image of a heroic suffering soldiers from the legions. So it was seen that he's destroying the image of a true Polish hero who suffers, dies, but he does it for Poland. And this response is not unique. In 1956, Tadeusz Konwicki published a novel which was called Marshes, about the guerrilla units, home army guerrilla units fighting in the eastern parts of Poland. And it was the same idea. The soldiers don't know what to do. they do want to go home. They don't understand the idea. They don't know what they are suffering. And Konwicki's marshes were really critiqued very badly. So this idea of trying to destroy the pattern of the importance of suffering, the idea of the ideological soldier who will do anything for homeland, for his Poland, whether it was 1937 or 1956, the response was similar. Rembek answered, "Moja wojna jest taka, jaka jest rzeczywiście. My war is the war I describe as it is." Even more, because he presented the soldiers, Polish soldiers, there's not actually heroic. They are scared. They desert the army. So he was accused that he's pro-Bolshevik because he published fragments of his novel in Robotnik, in a leftist, I don't know whether it was a weekly or a monthly, but anyway, daily. Okay, so he published this there. So he was accused of being pro-Bolshevik, yeah? And he was mostly accused by Juliusz Kaden-Bandrowski, who sort of saw him as a rival as far as the literature, war literature was concerned. But the suffering in the novel seems completely nonsensical. And in Wittlin's book, 1935, suffering is even more nonsensical because the main protagonist is called Unknown, Tomasz Niewiadomski, so Tomasz Unknown. And he is a son of a Pole and a Ukrainian woman. He's at Hucu, so sort of a Ukrainian, he's from the borderlands. He's illiterate, he is considered to be slow, and he does not understand why he is being drafted to the army, what he's supposed to do, why he's suffering. It was sort of a tale of a patient infantryman, an illiterate peasant who is unwillingly drafted into the Austrian army to fight, but he does not understand why and what for. It's at the same time, it's poetic and a philosophical novel, but basically the war is a bewilderment of a man involved in fighting against his will and national interest. Now, the question would be, those two novels, as you know, as I said, Rembek was completely non-existent after 1945, and Wittlin was, but it's one, critics say it's one of the best forgotten novels, meaning perfectly forgotten that although it's considered a masterpiece, it's still not, for instance, not part of the school curriculum. So the question would be, did the literature change anything? The simple answer would be no, because those 20 years, it was too short of a period to change the pattern. Also, the novels were written very late, just before the war. And suffering by that time was already part of Polish identity because it provided a framework in which individual suffering is structured around national suffering, yeah? Collective suffering. So this Polish identity is read through the concept of victimhood, suffering, and sacrifice. This literature did not influence it. And the problem I just wanted to point out in the last minute that I am allowed, I wanted to point out problems. And those are serious problems because the issue exists even today. First, that suffering is seen as an intrinsic element of Polish identity, but it has an element of superiority. Somehow when people suffer, they feel morally superior. Therefore, the world is presented as victims and abusers, and Poles are the blameless victims. This leads to this dichotomic understanding of Polish history. Victims versus perpetrators, Poles versus others, and this is Sienkiewicz's tradition. Yeah? Now, this type of approach omits completely Polish faults. And this is Żeromski's tradition, who says, well, uprising did not succeed, but this was the Polish fault. It was not done by others. It was by the policies of the there were many discussions in Żeromski's novel. Gorombrowicz belongs to the same tradition. But the other problem is that this type of narrative of suffering omits the suffering of other groups on Polish lands. Yeah? And I mentioned earlier that Polish does not mean ethnic. So for instance, when you say about Polish suffering, you omit other groups which are, for instance, Kashubian or Jewish suffering. Yeah? And now, to understand how strong is this pattern, and this is, please, 30 seconds. How strong is this pattern? I just want to point something that is happening right now in Poland. I want to show the language of suffering connected with the plane crash in which President Kaczyński died. 2 days ago, there's a new monument of Kaczyński in Warsaw, and the editor of the Gazeta Polska Codziennie asked people to come for the, what do you do with the monument? Unveiling, thank you, unveiling of the monument. And he said, I quote, "Please come for those fallen at Smoleńsk, poległym pod Smoleńskiem." President Kaczyński who poległ pod Smoleńskiem. In Polish, the word polec is strictly for dying at the battlefield. So even if you die from a wound that you got on a battlefield 3 months later, you are not awarded the word poległ. But in Polish, the necessity to put Kaczyński and the plane crash into the suffering narrative is visible in the language. And what is even more amazing, when you look at it, President Kaczorowski died in a plane crash, while President Kaczyński has fallen under Smolensk, yeah? 2 different narratives. So my answer would be no, literature of the mid-war period was not able to change the narrative. It still exists, it's still strong, especially in political situation, not in literature, but it is definitely a narrative that for 200 years defined Polish identity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. From cultural history, we move on to the terribly unfashionable but crucially important discipline of military history. And it is my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Andrzej Suchcitz, based at the Polish Institute and Sikorski Museum here in London, who will talk to us about the way that the Polish military was shaped by the struggle for Polish independence and vice versa.
There is often an assumption made that with the restoration of Poland to the map of Europe in November 1918, all its central institutions, including the army, were somehow miraculously in place. The business of governance could proceed forthwith. Whilst undoubtedly it was true that the nuclei of the varied essential state institutions were quickly established, it was by no means a done and dusted affair. Though, as we know from history, that there was indeed a Polish army in November 1918, and indeed that same month the Polish Navy was brought into existence by decree, it would be more correct to say that at the time there was a collection of Polish armies which needed welding into one homogeneous force. In October 1918, a nucleus of a Polish general staff was established in Warsaw, becoming the head of the German-sponsored Polnische Wehrmacht, the official force of the Kingdom of Poland, set up by the Central Powers in November 1916. By the end of October, German control and dominance of this force was visibly eroding, leaving the Poles greater freedom of maneuver. This they immediately took advantage of, exactly by setting up a general staff, and thus, by implication, the central deciding institution running the Polish army. This is not the place to go into the political maneuvering of the various Polish political options. Suffice to say that the Regency Council, running the Kingdom of Poland, passed on full political and military powers to Józef Piłsudski, recently released by the Germans from Magdeburg prison and put on a train for Warsaw. In short, he became Chief of State and Commander-in-Chief of the Polish Army. In the following months, he was to be the crucial factor in the steady unification of the Polish Army. However, in November 1918 and the months following, he was faced with a situation in which there were at least 4 major Polish military formations. The first was the Polish military organization, PLW, loyal to Piłsudski, many of whose members had been in the legionary brigades. Secondly, there was the Polish army in France under General Józef Haller. This force, officially recognized as part of the Allied forces, was politically subordinated to the Polish National Committee in France, itself independent of Warsaw. Apart from the divisions which were in France, it also controlled the 4th Division in Odessa, in southern Russia, and the 5th Division in Siberia. Thirdly, there was the Polnische Wehrmacht in central Poland, which formed the basis of the military in Warsaw in the crucial months of October and November 1918. Last but not least, there was the army of the Duchy of Wielkopolska under General Józef Dobór-Muśnicki, which soon had its hands full fighting to evict the German army from the province. Apart from what had been the Polnische Wehrmacht and the Polish military organization, the central authorities in Warsaw did not have any meaningful control over the other two formations. To these main military formations must be added a plethora of smaller local formations which had sprouted spontaneously following the collapse of Germany and Austria, with the aim of disarming the occupiers. It is a measure of their responsibility that these units soon became the basis of the Warsaw-controlled regular army, providing local garrisons and raising troops which were badly needed on the various battlefronts, of which later. To complicate matters even further, the nascent army had again at least 4 differing traditions, which had to be transformed into a distinctively Polish one. It should be noted that the army, so to speak, was being formed on the hoof in a period of great turmoil for the young state. The first of the traditions is what we can call the Polish tradition, made up from the men of the 3 legionary brigades and POW, Polska Organizacja Wojskowa. These were soldiers and, more importantly, commanding officers who in the main came from a civilian background, highly motivated in the struggle for Polish independence. They had belonged to various Polish paramilitary organizations before 1914 in the Austrian partition. Their fundamental aim was to fight for Poland's independence. In the majority of cases, they had learned their military craft during combat operations in the recent World War. Politically astute and aware, they provided a national outlook on the many varying aspects of the military. Many soon rose to senior command levels and were characterized by a flexibility of military thinking not automatically associated with the military from the 3 partitioning powers. The remaining traditions were those of the partitioning powers, that is, Russia, Austria, and Germany. Many of the senior officers who joined the Polish army in 1918-1919 had been professional career soldiers in those armies. Not surprisingly, they often had entrenched views on military organization, tactics, and strategy akin to the armies in which they had served for so many years. Their mentality was fixed in the battles which they had fought during the previous 4 years, and their military know-how and attitudes reflected those they had learnt and practiced for decades as professional soldiers in the armies of the 3 partitioning powers. Many had served far away from the Polish lands, notably those from the Tsarist army, and their knowledge of Poland was often based on what they had been taught at home decades earlier. For many, Russian or German was their natural language, and their knowledge of Polish at times was quite rudimentary. Yet these were the people who in the autumn of 1918 took over senior positions in the Polish army. Their one overriding common factor was their desire to serve the Polish cause. Though, it must be said that there was a small percentage of senior officers who saw the Polish army simply as a way of continuing their careers and saving themselves from the vagaries of revolutionary Russia and a defeated Austria-Hungary and Germany. They were but a small minority. Thus, one of the immediate tasks facing the new High Command was to forge a common Polish doctrine. This was easier said than done. It was to take many years to forge a distinctively Polish doctrine, both in the overall sense as in the doctrines of the individual arms of the army. It was not until May 1919 that the Greater Poland Army under General Dowbor-Muśnicki finally became an integral part of the Polish army. With its subordination to the Polish High Command on the 25th of May, it retained for a period its separate structure, though the names of its units were changed to come in line with those of the Polish army. In the summer of that year, General Haller's Blue Army from France also became fully integrated into the Polish army. This took place through an exchange of letters between Piłsudski as Commander-in-Chief and General Haller as Blue Army's General Officer Commanding, with the latter issuing a final farewell order on 9th of September. This can be seen as the symbolic moment of the final forging of the various military formations into one cohesive force, though the process of internal unification was to last much longer. The steady organization of the army from its inception was important in raising a professional force which was capable of undertaking operations immediately. That is not to say that the process was an easy one. In November 1918, the majority of the men under arms, some 30,000, were mainly volunteers, highly motivated and eager, many joining on the basis of local territorial conscription. However, this would not suffice in the developing circumstances. It was essential to create a steady flow of men, and by early 1919, national conscription had been introduced. By January 1919, there were 110,000 men, of which 21% were at the front. In April, this had become 156,000 men, of which 36% were at the front. By the early autumn of 1919, the Polish army was some 600,000 strong, with about 50% of the strength at the front. This was another indication showing that a year on, the Polish army was taking final shape and structure. It goes without saying that the process of creating a unified Polish army, with the beginnings of a distinctly Polish military tradition and doctrine, was greatly assisted by the fact that from the word go, the reborn Polish state found itself facing several conflicts at once, necessitating an immediate military response. Though officially restored to the family of states, Poland has as yet to secure its borders and secure the means for peaceful existence and development. From the beginning of November 1918, the Poles found themselves having to defend Lwów from an attempt by the West Ukrainian People's Republic to wrest control of the city. Their forces rose in the city on the 1st of November, and it was not until 3 weeks later that the siege was raised. However, it was not until late April 1919 that the city was at last free from direct Ukrainian shelling. The subsequent Polish counteroffensive threw the Ukrainians back across the rivers Bruch, bringing the war to an end in July. At the end of December 1918, Polish military insurgents in Greater Poland rose to oust the Germans from the province. Fighting ensued, known to history as the Wielka Polska Rising. By February, the Polish units had fought the Germans to a standstill. The Convention of 16th February, signed in Treves between the Entente and Weimar Germany, prolonged the armistice signed on 11th November, but also extended it to cover the Polish-German conflict in Greater Poland, as we have heard earlier. This allowed General Dowbor-Muśnicki in March 1919 to send units of the Greater Poland Army to aid the Polish forces fighting the Ukrainians in eastern Galicia. This in turn became one of the early defining moments as regards the integration of the army as a whole. Meanwhile, at the end of January 1919, the Czechoslovak government, taking advantage of Poland's perilous situation, broke the local agreement of 5th November 1918, signed between the Polish and Czech governing bodies in the Duchy of Teschen, which introduced a demarcation line following national ethnic lines. The Czechs carried out a surprise attack on Polish positions, leading to the Seven-Day War, which saw the Polish forces being pushed back to the Vistula. Entente pressure led the Czechs to cease operations, but the damage was done, and this set the scene for Polish-Czech relations for the next quarter century. Because of Poland having to defend Lwów, there were no forces which could be spared to reinforce Colonel Latinik's regiments in Teschen. To complicate matters further, the Bolshevik army was making steady progress westwards. At the same time, Polish forces on the northeastern front were moving eastwards, regaining control of territories which had once belonged to the pre-partition Commonwealth. A clash was inevitable, and already in January 1919, self-defense formations were taking part in defending Minsk and Wilno, though forced to withdraw. Regular warfare broke out in February. The Polish-Bolshevik War of 1919-1920 had commenced. By the summer of that year, the other armed conflicts, apart from the question of Silesia, had come to an end. The Greater Poland Army and the Blue Army had become part of the Polish Army. The process of creating an homogeneous, united national armed force was fast becoming a reality. There is a wonderful story related by Major General Jerzy Grobicki, who in the spring of 1919 was a major and chief of staff of the 9th Infantry Division on the Poleskie front. It illustrates wonderfully the complexities in the makeup of the Polish army at the time and explains some of the obstacles in creating an homogeneous force. The divisional commander, General Antoni Listowski, decided to carry out an impromptu inspection of the front. As it was a nice day, he decided to carry out the inspection in a light carriage rather than by vehicle. His aide-de-camp, a captain from a Tsarist army, spoke to the accompanying military policeman in Russian. The surprised general commented, "What, a Russian?" The captain explained that no, the guard was a half Pole and half Georgian, raised in the Caucasus, orphaned early and brought up by his Georgian grandmother. Following the revolution, he made his way west to Poland, intent on joining the Polish army. The general nodded his head in understanding. They drove on towards the front. In the opposite direction, coming towards them, was a soldier in the blue-grey uniform of General Haller's army from France. He smartly saluted the senior personage in the carriage. General Listowski stopped the carriage and asked where he was from. The soldier looked at the general and stammered, "Je suis désolé, mon général, je ne comprends pas un mot, je ne parle pas polonais." "What?" exclaimed the surprised general, and in perfect French asked the soldier how come he was serving in the Polish army. The latter replied that he was a Pole, the grandson of exiles who settled in France after the 1863 Rising. His grandfather had served in the Foreign Legion, his father in the French army, and was wounded in 1914. He thus sent his son to join the Polish army. He did not know Polish because his mother was a Spaniard, and he had been brought up in Algiers. However, his father always told him that he was a Pole, and thus he is now here. The general gave the soldier a cigarette and clapped him on his way. The general mused in what strange ways these Polish soldiers were returning to their fatherland, one from the Caucasus, one from Algiers. They finally arrived at the rears of the front line. There, a group of lancers were cleaning their equipment. The general alighted from the carriage, and the senior NCO called his men to attention and reported to the general, who in turn asked him how he came to serve in the regiment. The NCO turned red, and when asked by Listowski whether he understood, replied, "Rozumiem, panie general, aber ich sprech nicht Polnisch." "What, a German?" exclaimed the visibly irritated general. At that, the squadron commander came up and explained that the soldier was a Pole, born in the German Cameroon, and raised by a Germanized relative of his parents who had died when he was young. He subsequently served in the German army in Europe and was taken prisoner by the Poles during the Greater Poland Rising, and as a Pole had joined the Polish army. Deep in thought, the general ordered that he be taken back to his HQ. Turning to his aide-de-camp, he commented, "Really, this Polish army is very strange. I spoke with 3 soldiers today, and none of them could speak Polish. Is it possible that there are no real Poles in this army?" Ironically, the general himself, though born in Warsaw, had served as a professional soldier in the Tsarist army in the far depths of the empire, far away from the Polish lands. And this was the nub of the point. Despite the general's questioning of their Polishness, these soldiers were indeed real Poles. In their differing situations, they had all held on to their Polish family traditions, passed on from father to son or mother to son, creating in them a new legend, which bred in them a feeling of duty to carry out their obligations to the idea of a free Poland. This same feeling of responsibility led them to join the ranks of the re-emerging Polish army at the earliest opportunity. And in many ways, this was the glue which would so effectively and quickly make the Polish army an homogeneous force in such a short time. By the early autumn of 1919, the first year's campaign of the Polish Bolshevik War was drawing to a close. It had been a successful year for the young Polish army, having repelled the Bolshevik advance westwards and forced them back across the Berezina River on the northeastern front. On the southeastern front, following the end of the Polish-Ukrainian War in July 1919, Polish forces were lined up on the river's Bruch. By this time, one can start talking of a homogeneous and united army, there now ensued a lull in any serious fighting apart from Operation Winter in January 1920. This lull allowed for the further consolidation of the Polish army, both at the front and, more importantly, on the home front. There was a flurry of activity, both as far as the central organization of the army was concerned, the creation of new units and formations, recruitment, arranging of arms, supplies, and production. And more importantly, putting in place a myriad of laws and decrees necessary for any state to function normally. All this was to be of fundamental importance during the next year, a year in which the unity and resilience of the newly reborn Polish army would be tested to the limits. And as we know, it would emerge from these tests victorious. There could be no better or stronger unifying glue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For the final paper of this panel and the final paper of this wonderful conference, it's my pleasure, in a spirit of friendly collaboration, to invite Dr. James Bjork, who is a reader in modern European history at UCL's great London rival, King's College London, to present his paper. He is an expert on religious history and is currently working on the Polish Catholic Church and the Polish Catholic faith in post-World War II Poland, and we're delighted to have him to talk today about the way the Catholic faith and the Catholic Church was shaped by the struggle for Polish independence during the First World War and after. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Thomas. And I'd like to also just start by thanking Richard Butterwick-Pawlikowski for the kind invitation to participate, and to everyone who's involved in organizing this conference. I'm really sorry I couldn't attend the morning session due to some immovable obligations at my home institution, but I'm glad I was able to come for the second half. What I'll be talking about today is a familiar, indeed quite central institution in longer-term narratives of Polish history, the Roman Catholic Church. But it's interesting that the Church tends to be much less central in discussions of 1918 and of the creation of a fully independent Polish state after the First World War. I think that is at least partly related to the common view that the Church as an institution and Catholicism as a set of practices and beliefs has been much more a feature of the Polish nation rather than the Polish state. Catholicism, in other words, was one of the elements of a resilient Polish national culture that transcended and survived the partitions of the Polish state in the 18th century, sustaining an indestructible sense of Polishness through more than a century of Austrian, Prussian, and Russian rule. For the Church, in this understanding, 1918 simply involved the removal of foreign imperial constraints, allowing an inherently Polish national institution at last to nest comfortably within a new Polish nation state. In it, if we try to identify and describe the seemingly familiar character of Polish Catholicism, an entity that predates and was independent from a Polish state, this actually proves to be surprisingly difficult. The most plausible definitions point to shared qualities that tied together dozens of bishops, thousands of priests, monks, and nuns, and millions of lay people. Polish Catholicism as a state of mind, one might say. One such quality would be a resilient memory of a previous Polish state, the pre-partitions Commonwealth, and a related desire to restore a future Polish state. This form of patriotic sentiment was no doubt common throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, but its active expression was much more the exception than the rule among the clergy and devout Catholics. This was due not only, of course, to repression by the imperial states involved that ruled the former Polish lands, but also to a very consistent message from the leadership of the Catholic Church that armed uprisings against imperial authority were immoral and illegitimate. This message was most famously and forcefully articulated by Pope Gregory XVII's encyclical Cum Primum on civil disobedience in 1832 in the wake of the November uprising against Tsarist rule. But calls to obedience to imperial sovereigns remained the norm among Catholic bishops and clergy of all the Polish lands through the early stages of the First World War. I just went to briefly an image of what this kind of imperial Catholic loyalty looks like. I'm not sure how easy it is to discern the figures there. It's a somewhat counterintuitive juxtaposition. The intuitive parts on the center and right of the Pope on the right, and the Virgin Mary in the form of the Black Madonna in the center. But Kaiser Wilhelm seems to be a sort of odd interloper here. This is a bit of a reach in terms of its propagandistic effect, because it was being distributed in the Congress Kingdom as it started to come under German rule. And so in that sense was a little bit counterintuitive in terms of encouraging the local population to switch imperial rule. But the starting point, the model that it's working with for the existing population of the Prussian partition, was entirely unremarkable. These were loyalties that went together for generations of inhabitants of those regions. And during the First World War, hundreds of thousands of residents of what would become an independent Poland dutifully fought against one another in imperial armies. That overall pattern of loyalism only ended after the empires themselves had collapsed. A second way of defining Polish Catholicism would focus on language. In this definition, it would be Polish-speaking Catholicism, a community in which the Polish language was closely associated with religious belief and practice. And the Catholic Church did indeed teach that one's mother tongue was a valuable heritage, and especially crucial for educating children in the tenets of the faith. This general principle could translate into quite spirited defenses of the Polish language in particular. Probably the most famous manifestation of this was in the mass school strikes, very strongly supported by the local Catholic clergy, that broke out in the Poznan region in 1901 and again in 1906, when the Prussian government attempted to introduce German language religious instruction in schools. The Church, of course, also fostered the maintenance of Polish and other earlier homeland languages among immigrants in North America in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, even going so far as to sanction the creation of what were known as national parishes. In other words, parishes that were defined by the language of pastoral care rather than strictly in territorial terms. The general defense of parishioners' mother tongues was, however, a double-edged sword for advocates of any specific national cause, including the Polish cause, where local residents spoke dialects of Lithuanian, Belarusian, Ukrainian, or German, for example. It could justify resistance to the inculcation of standardized Polish. Furthermore, the Catholic Church's support for mother tongue or for ancestral language was always contingent and situational, a negotiable means to an end rather than an ultimate aim. As one Polish patriotic priest, Emil Szramek, succinctly put it in a long disquisition on the subject, the mother tongue is not necessary for salvation. In Europe, as in North America, the Church ultimately played an important role in facilitating as well as resisting linguistic assimilation. Over time, of course, millions of descendants of 19th century Polish-speaking Catholics ended up becoming 20th century German or English-speaking Catholics. So we can see that these two ways of defining Polish Catholicism, first as a community of patriotic memories and patriotic aspirations, second as a linguistic community, are useful but limited. The first represented a rather small minority of inhabitants of what would become the Polish Second Republic. The second was a larger but fundamentally unstable community, subject to the vagaries of multilingualism and intergenerational linguistic acculturation. Already heard quite a few examples of this. What is noticeably absent in either definition is any relationship to the formal institutions of the Roman Catholic Church. Indeed, despite the situational affinities that have often arisen between Roman Catholicism and any number of nationalist sentiments, including Polish, the early 20th century Roman Catholic Church simply did not work with or really recognize nationality at all in its own structures. Ecclesiastical governance fundamentally jumped from the universal, the papacy and the Roman Curia, to the regional and the local, the diocese and its constituent parishes. There was really no organizational level that corresponded to classic East Central European understandings of nationality as cultural nationality. As I mentioned a moment ago, the Vatican did recognize national parishes in this sense at the local level, but only in North America. It was a concession to immigrant communities there, not as the organizing principle within Europe. Their Latin Rite parishes, as well as dioceses, were defined purely by territory. Now, there was, to be sure, a consultative and informal level of organization that corresponded to the level of the sovereign state, so the nation as a political entity. And these were constituted in what were so-called national episcopal conferences, composed of bishops whose territories were within the boundaries of a particular state. So the only formally national institutions in that sense that existed within the Roman Catholic Church prior to 1916 divided rather than united Polish Catholicism. When the Archbishop of Gniezno-Poznan, for example, consulted with his peers within a formal episcopal conference, it was with the German Conference of Bishops. The same was true for the Bishop of Kraków when it came to consulting with the Austrian Conference of Bishops. The bishops of what would later become Polish dioceses really had no formal connection to one another whatsoever, and only rarely, if ever, had occasion to meet. The first hints of a Polish episcopate appeared already in 1917, spurred by the creation, as we've heard before, of the Kingdom of Poland the previous year. Although this was an entity dependent on the central powers, the kingdom was a formally independent entity, and so, as was the norm, the bishops whose dioceses lay on the territory of the new state started to meet to consult on shared policy concerns. More unusually and provocatively, the bishops from the Austrian partition, as well as the Archbishop of Gniezno-Poznan from the Prussian partition zone, attended one of the first meetings, providing a glimpse of what would become a larger Polish episcopate in the interwar period. But it was, for that moment, only a glimpse. An official episcopal conference with a membership spanning the previous partition zones would have to await the establishment of the Second Republic in November 1918, and the creation of a truly robust and substantive Polish Catholic Church, rather than simply a collection of dioceses and parishes that had to lay on the territory of the Second Republic. That process would take many years and really remain in some ways an incomplete project, even at the end of the Republic's lifespan. So just want to put up a couple maps of the diocesan structure of Poland. Don't really want to dwell on the details here, but just in terms of what it meant for the church within Poland to become national, one element of that was making external boundaries of dioceses congruent with state boundaries. So is it for Poland, as for every other sovereign state, there's strong interest in preventing dioceses that crossed international frontiers. So this involved quite a bit of tidying up, particularly in the east, but a bit on the western frontiers as well. And in the second map, you can also see certain steps toward kind of mixing dioceses in different ways into metropolitan clusters of dioceses. This is a fairly light organizational level in that a metropolitan really had no serious authority over constitutive dioceses. It was really a sort of first among equals status, but it was an attempt to, again, move past the old partition boundaries. But as you can see, in terms of the actual diocesan boundaries, they continue to map very closely onto, and you could still see sort of the ghost of the old partition zones in the boundaries of dioceses. So how are we to measure the development of a coherent and integrated Polish Catholicism? There are many possible ways to do so, but I wanted to briefly discuss two that I found helpful in thinking through what the establishment of an independent Polish state meant for the Roman Catholic Church. The first is engagement in debates about the relationship between church and state. Now, one might think this would have started to create an almost instant centripetal dynamic, as bishops who had previously been looking to Berlin, to Vienna, to St. Petersburg in order to influence and to respond to changes in legal and administrative norms, now had every incentive to turn to Warsaw. But the policy expectations and preferences of individual bishops were shaped by the very different imperial systems in which they had been raised and to which they had often become habituated. bishops of former Prussian and Austrian dioceses in particular often feared that the new Polish state would end up being a less hospitable environment for the Roman Catholic Church than the empires to which they had previously been attached. And a couple of specific examples to help to illustrate that point. Land reform was, of course, an early priority of the left and the center left in the Polish Second Republic, and the expropriation of church lands was one potential component of such an agenda. Now, bishops from the former Russian Empire tended to be much less exercised about this possibility, while their colleagues from the Prussian and Austrian zones viewed it with much greater alarm. And the reason for this disparity was simple. The vast majority of the lands that had previously been owned by the Catholic Church in the Russian partition had already been confiscated, partially in the aftermath of the failed uprisings of 1831 and 1863. So the Church had little additional left to lose. In former German and especially in former Austrian regions, by contrast, the Church still disposed of thousands of hectares of often fairly large land holdings and was determined to fight the threat of further expropriations. An even more central issue for the Church, arguably really the single greatest preoccupation of the Church across Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was the fate of religious education, particularly in primary schools. Across most of the Second Polish Republic, the new emerging system of state schools allowed 2 hours of religious education per week. In the former Russian partition, this seemed a pretty good deal for the Catholic Church. Previously, after all, many children had not even been attending any kind of primary school, so any provision for religious education represented progress in their view. But for bishops and priests in the former Prussian partition, 2 hours of religious education in a non-confessional school seemed to be a horrifying step backwards. Before 1918, almost every Catholic child had attended an explicitly Catholic, state-supported confessional school with at least 4 hours of religious education per week. Vigorous lobbying by the local church and sympathetic political parties guaranteed a special dispensation for schools in former Prussian lands, where 4 hours of religious instruction per week continued to be the norm. But supporters of the Pilsudski regime and others on the center left lambasted this exceptionalism as the Church's attempt to defend the old German schools against the introduction of proper Polish schools. A degree of lingering identification with German, Austrian, and to some lesser extent Russian imperial legacies was inevitable in the short term. Those raised and trained within particular imperial state systems did not forget them overnight, and new systems that applied across all of Poland often took years to be negotiated and put into place. Whether these identifications would persist into the medium and long term depended in part on geographic career mobility among the Catholic clergy, and particularly in the Catholic episcopate. If dioceses remained largely self-contained, and those who, say, ran a given diocese in the 1930s had been born, educated, and ordained in that diocese, then one might expect the process of integration and unification to have been very slow indeed. As it turned out, the interwar Catholic Church in Poland did witness a noticeable surge in geographic mobility, especially at the highest echelons. Prior to 1918, for the previous generation or two, it was unheard of for a bishop to have been born and trained outside of the empire in which his diocese was located. From the early 1920s, however, it suddenly became quite common for dioceses to be assigned a priest, to be assigned a bishop who had been a priest, who would have counted as a foreigner prior to 1918. In other words, somebody who had been born and raised and trained in a different empire. But the pattern of such appointments were strikingly unidirectional. They exclusively involved men born and raised in the Prussian partition, being put in charge of dioceses on former Russian territory. There were no instances of movement in the other direction. Interesting, the former Austrian dioceses remained a fairly sort of self-contained zone, neither importing nor exporting bishops. And so the result was a kind of extraordinary Prussianization of the Polish episcopate in the interwar period, a pattern that was incidentally continued after the Second World War and remained quite striking. Just to, in terms of a couple graphs, So the proportions of ordinary bishops, in other words, the bishops who actually ran a particular diocese, and at the moment of independence in 1918, to roughly reflect both sort of the number of dioceses in each partition zone and broadly reflect the proportions of population, where the Russian zone being by far the largest and most populous. By the end of the Second Republic, you again see the Austrian portion holding fairly steady, but with an increasing number of Russian dioceses becoming under the governance of bishops who were born and raised in the Prussian zone. That proportion shifts quite markedly. Contemporary observers were quite aware of this trend. An article in the Catholic periodical Głos Narodu in 1926, for example, noted that almost every new episcopal appointment in the Second Republic's brief existence was starting to involve a native of the former Prussian lands, and so trying to figure out what was going on there. They noted that the new primate, August Lond, in addition to the post of primate, involved a Prussian diocese, but this was a native of Upper Silesia who was taking on this overarching symbolic role. Also noted Theodor Kubina, who became the first bishop of the new diocese of Częstochowa, another Silesian who had previously been the pastor in the parish of Katowice, also Czesław Rukomski, a native of Poznania, who had been named the new bishop of Łomża in the northeastern part of the old Congress Kingdom. Speculating on the reasons behind this pattern, the authors suggested that natives of the Prussian zone had been toughened by especially had been toughened by the especially rigorous religious and national persecutions, but they also suggested that those from the Prussian zone had greater experience with the implementation of Catholic social teaching and also had more experience with imaginative pastoral care. So that mix of reasoning reflected, I think, the delicate balancing act involved in treating the former Prussian lands as a central recruiting ground for the leadership of the Catholic Church in the Second Republic. If the point was that the church under Prussian rule had been a kind of church of the catacombs, struggling against constant oppression, this raised uncomfortable questions about why this experience would be the best training for life in a free and independent Poland. If instead the point was that the Catholic Church under Prussian rule had been able to develop exceptionally robust ways that should serve as a model for development elsewhere, this explanation risks flirting with the uncomfortable impression that the transition to Polish rule had been a regression for the church. However awkward it was for the leadership of the interwar church to be disproportionately recruited from former Prussian lands, this was, I would argue, a crucial feature not only of the interwar church, but as I mentioned, really of Polish national integration across the 20th century. So we see this again after 1945. And what's interesting, I think important here, is that this pattern was the precise inverse of patterns evident among most other state elites and secular cultural elites, where recruitment of elites was overwhelmingly from the Austrian and Russian partition zones, and Prussian origins tended to be a rarity. So if one looks, for say, at the origins of school teachers or civil servants, or at a higher level of cabinet ministers, it would have been easy to make the argument that for the population of Poznania, and even more so the population of Pomorza or Upper Silesia, the transition to Polish rule risked representing yet another form of rule by outsiders. The Catholic hierarchy, I think, was really the one significant elite in independent Poland where those from the former Prussian lands were not only well represented, but dominant. And this, I think, provided a kind of ballast to what was otherwise a strikingly lopsided set of regional power relations in the new nation state. So I think that overall pattern applied to the officer corps and the military, but I defer to my colleague on confirming that. So my focus in this talk on the ongoing importance of Austrian, Russian, and Prussian legacies within the interwar Polish state might seem somewhat misplaced or even a bit perverse. This conference, after all, is meant to commemorate what was in many ways the most spectacular moment demonstrating the resilience of Polishness, of a national program that had suffered so many setbacks in the previous century and a half, only to be, to quote the conference title, restored, reborn, regained in November 1918. But I hope this discussion has made clear that the memory of and even partial identification with divergent experiences of Austrian, Prussian, and Russian rule were not the antithesis of Polish patriotism, but unavoidable components of what Polishness could mean after 1918. As historians, we know that past experiences are constantly reworked, repackaged, reinterpreted. Again, we've heard quite a bit about that throughout the day. But they can never simply be subtracted or erased altogether. Just to cite a comparison, I think most of us here are old enough to remember, have a vivid memory of German unification in 1990. And this process famously involved a wave of what was quite authentic enthusiasm, especially among residents of the German Democratic Republic, for immediate union. But this was followed by an equally authentic wave of disillusionment, again, especially among the residents of the former German Democratic Republic. This disillusionment featured striking displays of nostalgic identification with a past that had apparently just been resoundingly repudiated. So it should not surprise us that the revival of Polish state provoked similar ambivalence and uncertainty. The Catholic clergy living on the state, on the territory of that state, had worked over many years to promote their own agenda within the framework of empire, with a mix of successes and failures. After those empires collapsed, they waited with a mix of hope and anxiety to see whether the emerging state would emancipate them from the legacies of imperial rule that they deplored, or would instead undermine legacies of imperial rule that they had come to embrace. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you to all three speakers today for fitting into the allocated time limit, which gives us just under 10 minutes to take questions from the floor. Please.
This is a question for Dr. Bjork. I found this presentation very interesting, and I think that the implications of what happened, the increasing importance within the Church in Poland of people from Prussian Poland, probably needs to be examined on a also ideological or doctrinal level. And I wonder if you would comment on what Brian Porter has written in his book, When Nationalism Turned to Hate. As I understand his argument, he talks generally about the emergence of integral nationalism on the Polish lands, but he spends a lot of time discussing the changes within church doctrine generally, which of course Roman occultist res finita, but affected clearly the local situation in Poland. And what he argues is that really in the 1870s and 1880s, the church was hostile to nationalism, as you pointed out with this very graphic poster, which was distributed in the Kingdom of Poland, and saw nationalism as part of modernity, social Darwinism, hating one's neighbour rather than loving one's neighbour, which it rejected. But then from the 1890s, this situation changed. The church felt itself increasingly under pressure from without, Masons, capitalism, Jews, groups which were threatening the church, and came to see itself as an enclave threatened from without, a view of the world which was greatly strengthened by the Bolshevik Revolution, and which clearly affected the stance of the Polish Catholic Church and of the leadership and the hierarchy of the primate in the interwar period. Can this be related to the Prussian character of people like Holland, Kubina, Lukomsky, all of whom are on the right of the church in this respect? Not quite so strikingly, but to express quite strong views about the embattled nature of the church and of the threats which the church faces in the new situation.
Yeah, it's a really interesting, important question, but a complicated one, what the relationship is between those ideological currents and this kind of shifting geographic distribution, those power relationships. I think on the whole, there is a lot to the idea, and maps also onto for voting patterns. Many people will be familiar with in interwar Poland that the former Prussian zone was the strongholds for the National Democrats, where, especially getting to the interwar period, integral Catholicism and integral nationalism tended to fuse more rather than being intention, as they tend to be a bit more in the late 19th century. But it is a complicated picture, and some of this, digging to my old bailiwick of Upper Silesia that I've studied in most detail. You may be familiar in terms of some of these names do conjure a bit, thinking both of the interwar period, even a bit after the Second World War. Figures like, say, Lukomsky were very much national democratic activists. Kubina has a rather different claim to fame as the sort of one voice condemning the Kielce pogrom, and was an activist in the National Labor Party, so within the church about as far left as you can go. And so that reflects within kind of Silesian-based Christian democracies, a different set of traditions that continues on in a kind of complicated relationship to core national democracy. So I think I slightly complicate, I think, the picture in terms of how those different trajectories relate to each other.
Thank you very much. We have a question over here.
Perhaps it's late in the day, but I thought it's worth recording this for future discussion. This reference to the Roma Sinti community in Poland. In the sort of reborn Poland, I wonder if there's a place for that community too, in the narrative. And let's say this community doesn't figure in this narrative now. Can I ask whose responsibility it is that they figure in the Polish narrative?
I don't know that much about the Roma community in pre-war period, but I wanted to say that the knowledge about the suffering of the Roma people, Roma porajamos, this is becoming a narrative in Poland. And this matters because Polish uses a special word for suffering, martyrologia. So martyrologia used to be in the 50s and 60s exclusively Polish. It's not working.
It's working.
Then it was used about the Jewish suffering, and now it's also used about the Roma suffering. Richard wants to add something. No?
Oh, it's okay.
Museum in Tarnów has
Yeah.
a big display on Roma.
And I also, because I have been doing some work on suffering, next year we will have, I'm the editor of the Polish Review issue on suffering, but not Polish suffering, it's the suffering on Polish lands. So we are discussing how does other suffering influences the concept of Polish identity. So we are dealing with Jewish, Roma, Kashubian, Silesian, German, Ukrainian, and Wemka people in one volume, just to look at, because this is suffering taking place in different periods. And for instance, I know therefore a little bit more about the Kashubians and their religion problems, because they spoke Kashubian at home, but they always exclusively prayed in Polish. So they had problems both during the partitions and during the Second Republic and after 1945. So there are some communities which did not succeed very well. And now, well, the Kashubian community is basically losing its language. It's mostly the old people who speak Kashubian, and after 1989, despite all the support of the state, Kashubian is, yeah. But anyway, there is more, there are finally books, and there's more knowledge about Porajamos.
Thank you very much. We have I'm afraid, time for one more question, and can I pass it over? Sorry about this.
Yeah, it's true. We have very little time left, but still I would ask Dr. Suchcitz to develop a bit your presentation. Namely, what is your opinion of the role of French mediation in forming Polish?
That's a very good question, and a complicated one, which I'm sure you're far more able to answer than I can. We have to remember that for France, the idea of creating of a new Poland and a Polish army was important in their view, but to counterbalance a potential Germany in the future. And to a certain extent, it was a race, maybe the wrong word, but there was a certain Wichtig who will have influence on the Polish army, who will have the influence to then for purchasing or selling of military armaments and doctrine. And there, I think, that's why the French military mission was by far the largest of the various military missions, because there's also a British military mission and an Italian military mission. Remember, the Polish army under General Haller was commanded by the divisions were commanded by several French generals who also arrived in Poland in 1919. And in the first part of the Polish Bolshevik War, they did actually command these divisions at the front. And the Poles also had a national affinity with France, so it was more logical for the Polish authorities, the Polish government and the Polish High Command to look towards France as the potential ally, her most important potential ally, and thus I think the role of the French military mission was very strong. And it wasn't only until during the end of the war, but it continued well into the mid-1920s.
Thank you. And Professor Prozmoska, we have one chance for one last question. Thank you.
This is a positive discrimination question. A question to Dr. Suchcitz. With the diverse backgrounds of the people who are coming into the uniformed army, do they also bring with them different ideas about who is the enemy of the Polish nation?
Oh.
Sorry.
We know that we Poles, everyone surrounding us is our enemy. I mean, whether they actually brought any new ideas as to who was the enemy of Poland, I don't really think so. I think that was long established, that there was a set mind that the main enemies were Russia and Germany, in whatever form. It doesn't really make a difference whether they're communists or czarists. It's seen as, let's say, Russian. Unfortunately, well, we know the Polish-Czech relations are bad from the word go, so to speak. One thing which I think has to be underlined and emphasized is that with the 1938 Polish-Czech crisis, the Polish military and the Polish government had one underlying fundamental principle. In the event of a war, Poland must never find itself on the side of Germany. It has to be an allied war where Poland is together with France and Britain. That was, in the Polish government's thinking, the only way that Poland will be restored, if not straight away and not helped straight away, which happened in 1939. But the West said, no, we will not come to Poland's aid immediately. But that was the only guarantor that a Polish state would re-arise at the end of a potential war.
Thank you very much. And I think now we have a chance for concluding remarks. Richard, would you like?
Well, very briefly, since we have come to the end of our time, I would just like to extend my warm thanks on behalf of UCRCs to all of you who participated in this conference, either in the audience or as speakers or in chairing panels, and the people who've recorded it. And I hope that the recording of the conference will be made available on the UCL website before very long. And particular thanks to everyone who's made this conference possible for our support from the Polish Embassy, from Katarzyna here, and to Tom, Katarzyna, to one exhibition, and to our logistic team support here. So thank you very much for being part of this today.